Hello everyone and welcome. This is the 15th semester of the massive open online course for the University of Nicosia's master's degree in digital currencies. I'm your teacher, Andreas and Antonopoulos. I'm super excited. Today we have a huge crowd. So many students have enrolled in this semester and so much excitement and so many great questions on the forum. I wonder why there's such interest in Bitcoin right now and open blockchains. I wonder what is driving all. Oh, I know, you're all excited. Well, we're not going to talk about the price here, but we are going to talk about the technology behind this incredible system and what makes it special. So let's get started right away. We have tons and tons of questions. Remember, if you want to ask questions, please ask them during the week in the forums so we can collect them and organize them and prepare them for your answers during the live session. I will be taking a look in the chat every now and then just in case there's a follow-up, but I won't be answering questions directly from the chat because we need you to prepare during the week. So let's get started. First question comes from Juan Carlos. Why is the Byzantine Generals problem important in the first place, and where else can we find this problem in technology? Also, if the problem is found elsewhere, how has it been attempted to be solved in those other occasions? That's a great question, Juan Carlos. The Byzantine Generals problem, more generally, is about coordinating people who are in a distributed situation. So participants in distributed networks, in a way where the coordination does not require a central authority and cannot have a central authority, and where you cannot trust the other participants or the communication between them. And so this has a unique application in the area of decentralized money. Obviously, because you have competing interests between the participants. So if you want to create decentralized money, solving this is of paramount importance. But the Byzantine Generals problem is solved in many systems. And of course, it can be solved with various forms of centralization more easily than the mechanism in which Bitcoin's proof-of-work consensus algorithm or other decentralized consensus algorithms solve the Byzantine Generals problem. So there are many systems that are so-called Byzantine fault tolerant, where you can have participants, for example, in a replicated decentralized database, arrive at a common state through collaboration, and those systems make different trade-offs. So it depends on what you're trying to achieve. Byzantine's general problem has broad applicability in distributed systems. Anytime you have replicated databases and you want to ensure that you can synchronize state, you come across the Byzantine Generals problem. However, solving it in such a way as to maintain as much decentralization as possible and making it robust to attacks is not easy. And of course, that's where Bitcoin's solution comes in. As a follow-up to that question, Michel asks, the generals are actually the miners and nodes. Is this correct? Yes, all of the participants in the peer-to-peer network, which includes both mining nodes and non-mining, simply validating nodes, are the generals in this particular case. What you want to do is coordinate among all of the nodes that are participating in the network in such a way that they cannot fool each other and provide fake information, but can eventually arrive at a common truth, if you like, about what the state of the blockchain is. Courtney asks, are there other technologies since Bitcoin that have also solved this problem that are more promising objectively? Yes, there are other technologies that have solved this problem. There are a dozen different variations of Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus algorithms that are used out there. Proof of work, proof of stake, various other proof of something, as well as various federated signing and federated authority mechanisms used to build Byzantine fault-tolerant systems. So the question is, which ones of these are more promising objectively. And the problem is that objectivity in this case doesn't really exist, because objectively means that you have in mind a certain set of assumptions as to what the problem you're trying to solve is. So if you are asking, if the problem that you're trying to solve is simply Byzantine fault tolerance, of course, you can use any one of these algorithms and you can solve Byzantine fault tolerance. But if the problem you're trying to solve is creating a very decentralized Byzantine fault tolerance system that is also robust and can resist attacks, both coordinated attacks as well as attacks by perhaps state-level actors, because what you're building is a global, decentralized, open economy and payment system that needs to be able to survive attacks, then proof of work seems to be the best solution for that problem today. So there is no objective here, because, simply speaking, every one of these Byzantine fault tolerance solutions makes a different set of trade-offs. It values different outcomes. And so it depends on what your assumptions are, what your application is, as to what is the best fit for that application. In the case of robust, global, stable money that may be under attack because it is intended to be censorship resistant, then in my opinion, proof of work is the ideal system for that. It is the right trade-off between immutability, subjectivity, and overall tolerance to attacks. The ecological Byzantine generals problem. Daniel asks, since the uprising trend of Friday for Futures and environmental activists, could that be a potential risk for an energy-intensive consensus, like in the case of proof of work, in the future when mining farms are not operating as carbon neutral? I can imagine an ecological society where it is frowned upon to support a blockchain that is extremely detrimental to the environment, and that society outweighs the environmental disadvantages more than the societal advantages of using this consensus protocol. Daniel, every time we have a rally in Bitcoin, we see all of this negative attention to the environmental impact of Bitcoin. Apparently, it only matters when the price is high. It's really interesting to watch this conversation unfold, because a lot of it is driven, in my opinion, by sensationalism. So here's a couple of important assumptions to understand, and important assumptions that go into the criticism of proof of work as an environmental disaster that will surely melt the planet. So the first underlying assumption that you see in a lot of the analysis of ecological impact of Bitcoin is that it takes X many kilowatts to do a single transaction. And that assumption is based on faulty mathematics and a faulty understanding of how the system works. The number of transactions that happen on-chain, and especially even more so, the number of transactions that happen off-chain on second-layer networks as well as custodial exchanges, is not correlated at all to the cost of mining, to the amount of mining that happens. Mining is driven by price. Mining is driven by competition in an independent mining market where difficulty adjusts dynamically. It has nothing to do with how many transactions you're processing. Mining is a mechanism for security. It has to do with how much security the market allocates to this system. So more energy equals more security. And when the price of Bitcoin goes up, the amount of money that you need to protect is more, and therefore you need more security, which motivates miners to produce more security by consuming more energy. So the first faulty assumption is that the use of energy of Bitcoin scales to the number of transactions, and therefore faulty comparisons are made as to the transactional cost or the energy cost of a single transaction. That's just bad math. The second thing is to extrapolate linearly and say, listen, if it takes X kilowatts of energy to do one transaction today, and we have 7.5 billion people on the planet who will want to do one transaction per day each, then Bitcoin's energy consumption in the future will be Y. Again, this is faulty math based on false assumptions. As I said, energy doesn't scale to the number of transactions, but also the transactions don't scale linearly to the number of people, nor do they happen on-chain, nor does the blockchain scale in that particular way. So these are the kind of Malthusian analysis that we've seen in the past that take a current state of technology and extrapolate it far into the future, keeping all of the assumptions fixed and assuming no change in the mechanism that is used to scale that particular technology. Famously, Malthus did this in terms of the production of food, predicting that famine would destroy the human civilization as a result of the growth of the population, and we would not be able to feed as many people as we currently feed on the planet. And, you know, that is not actually true. Certainly, we do have the ability to produce enough food for everyone on the planet. So the third assumption that is particularly misleading and used a lot in sensationalism is equating energy consumption with pollution. So people say that, for example, every transaction pollutes, or Bitcoin's pollution is increasing, or Bitcoin produces pollution as a result of its energy consumption. That's simply not true. There is no direct correlation between energy usage and pollution because it depends entirely on what type of energy is used. Pollution is from the production of energy under certain circumstances. So if you're producing energy with coal, yes, that causes pollution and environmental impact. If you're producing energy with hydroelectric dams or wind or solar, for example, then you're not actually polluting. In fact, what you're doing is you're subsidizing those energy mechanisms and the creation of more solar, wind, geothermal, off-gassing, and other forms of energy through the application of Bitcoin as an economic factor in the production of that energy. So, again, if we decide as a society that we don't want polluting energy, then we should regulate the production of energy and not allow the use of polluting systems to be used for perhaps Bitcoin mining, or in fact for anything, because they will introduce carbon into the air. So, in fact, this is about regulating energy production and not about regulating the consumption of energy in one particular sector of the economy, which happens to be Bitcoin. The fourth and final assumption, which underpins all of this, is the idea of waste. And this is a normative judgment call. Basically, the idea is Bitcoin isn't useful. Therefore, any use of energy for Bitcoin is wasteful. And because it uses energy in a wasteful way because it doesn't do anything. However, that again is applying judgment onto the usability and usefulness of this particular technology. Well, the market doesn't believe that Bitcoin isn't useful. The market resoundingly believes that Bitcoin is useful in many different ways. And as a result, the market is allocating resources to this particular use. So if you want to decide that that's not a good use of resources, then what we're doing there is replacing market decision-making for political decision-making. And, you know, that may be appropriate for some political views in some countries where the political system substitutes market choices with politicians' choices. Certainly in capitalist societies, free markets, that is not the case. Again, if you start with the assumption that Bitcoin is useless, then obviously any energy used for it is wasteful. But of course, without making a what about argument, there are many other forms of energy use that are prima facie useless or even damaging in their use, and they don't receive the same amount of scrutiny. We can light up billions of Christmas lights every year for a completely pointless display of Christmas spirit. Is that pointless though? Not to the people who use it. So again, if you just start throwing these judgments around, you arrive at some very interesting analogies. The same thing with the number one use of energy, for example, in the United States outside of civilian markets, which of course is the Department of Defense. Our government uses enormous amounts of energy, and the largest polluter in the country is the Department of Defense. Now, what they do, is that useful? Is the war machine a useful thing to have in our society? And before you say, well, that's just comparing two different things, we should probably reduce the use of the war machine anyway, as well as the use of Bitcoin. But there's a very important link that is missing there, and that is that the war machine all around the world is funded directly by debt that is produced and paid off through inflation that is enabled through the uncontrolled central bank printing of money. So Bitcoin isn't just a solution for an open economy, it's also a solution that constrains government from producing currency at rates and using inflation as a hidden form of taxation to fund the war machine that pollutes more than anything else. Bitcoin isn't simply a substitute for general economic activity. It's also a direct control on the war machine that pollutes and uses far more energy to kill people. So in my opinion, those two things are very closely tied. But again, that's just my opinion. Let's move on to the next subject, which is the hashing algorithm and uses of the way that code is developed in Bitcoin. Vakal asks, is there another hashing algorithm better than or superior to SHA-256? Can a community decide to change or alter a hashing algorithm once they start using it? There may be hashing algorithms that are better in different ways. For example, Ethereum uses a variant of SHA-3 or Ketchak, which is another algorithm that's used for hashing. That's their choice, and that's different from Bitcoin's SHA-256. But bottom line, yes, the developers and the community and the miners can theoretically choose to change the hashing algorithm and use a different one than SHA-256. Except, of course, miners wouldn't do that. And the reason they wouldn't do that is because miners have hundreds of millions of dollars invested in equipment that is designed to do one thing only, and that is SHA-256. These are called application-specific integrated circuits. They are basically SHA-256 on silicon that are used to produce the hashing power of the proof-of-work algorithm. So, if they were to change the hashing algorithm in Bitcoin, that would invalidate the entire industrial infrastructure that they have invested hundreds of millions of dollars into, and would require them to build completely new chips for a completely different algorithm and start from scratch. Unlikely to happen. So while people can change the code, the economics of switching hashing algorithms, at least in Bitcoin, are not likely to happen. So who can change the code? Claudio asks, I wonder how many developers there are today developing Bitcoin and how they are organized. Who decides what to change? How do they find agreement? Are they paid by someone? Claudio, you can actually get the answer to that by looking on the various GitHub repositories where collaborative code development happens in Bitcoin. But when we say developing Bitcoin, we've got to decide exactly what that means. There are a number of different software projects that use Bitcoin in many different ways. So there are tens of thousands of developers who build code that interfaces with Bitcoin. On the other hand, there are a handful of projects that implement the consensus algorithm and the network node software that participates in the peer-to-peer network and validates consensus, as well as the software that implements mining. And almost all of those are based on one core reference implementation called Bitcoin Core. Bitcoin Core is a software project that's developed on GitHub collaboratively. You can go look at the statistics of that project. There are a couple thousand developers who have contributed in various ways to Bitcoin Core, but there are only about 100 developers who are actively developing on Bitcoin Core, and there are a subset of those, probably about 20 or 30, who are prolific developers and contributors to Bitcoin Core. Now, who pays them? It depends. Some of them are independently financed through effectively their ability to hold Bitcoin over time and its appreciation in value. Some have day jobs and they do Bitcoin as a side job or a hobby, which is very common in the open source community. And many are financed by grants or various support systems by various companies in the Bitcoin space that pay to keep core developers working on Bitcoin Core. And in many cases, they're paid to just do that and nothing else. The companies that fund them have very little influence in, or in fact, no influence in what these developers actually code. Because the bottom line is that these developers can get a job anywhere they want. And, you know, if you understand the ethos of Bitcoin, you understand that they don't really take input from anyone. So who decides what changes in the code? It's a collaborative process that involves public discussion and approval in a form of consensus, a form of social consensus that happens on GitHub. So you will actually watch people make proposals, and these proposals, whether they're big proposals for big changes, or they're small proposals like changing the implementation of a specific API call or something like that, and then you will see other people decide to chime in and offer review and commentary, etc. For big changes, like the upcoming Taproot soft fork that's about to happen in Bitcoin this year, these are processes that run for years. Taproot has been in development for just over 3 years, and perhaps even more from a research perspective. And that code has been reviewed by thousands of developers, and comments have been provided by hundreds of developers. And it's gone through many reviews, many alterations, and it's been tested by thousands of developers. So it's a very broad participatory system. All right. Diana asks, I know that Ethereum changed or is trying to change to proof of stake. Why haven't discussions like this happened for the Bitcoin blockchain too? Is it technically possible to change the Bitcoin consensus algorithm? What happens if in the future a new consensus algorithm appears that is much better and much more efficient? Could it be adopted for Bitcoin? Theoretically, yes. In practical terms, there'd be a lot of resistance, of course, because miners have enormous capital investment in the current consensus algorithm, but miners could be theoretically overridden in the case of a proof-of-stake system by a community hard fork. Now, on the other hand, whether a new consensus protocol appears that is better or more efficient depends on how you define better and more efficient and what application you're talking about. Proof of stake makes different trade-offs than proof of work, and these trade-offs are better suited for a decentralized finance smart contract type protocol that Ethereum is. For robust sound money that needs to maintain extremely conservative development and protection against perhaps state-level attacks, proof of work is more suitable, more better. And in terms of efficient, it is efficient at providing very, very high levels of security and does so very, very well and is very difficult to attack. So it's doing its job. the actual discussion about what is better and what is more efficient is often basically reflecting more the assumptions about what Bitcoin should be, or what Ethereum should be, or what the application use case should be. And that can very quickly get bogged down. So I think it's unlikely we're going to see a change in the consensus algorithm of Bitcoin unless there is a problem in the implementation of proof of work. In a similar vein, Pacharpruk asks, now that big corporations are accumulating a large portion of Bitcoin, they have skin in the game. Would it be possible that they will try and change the consensus rules to be more favorable to them and governments? Would it be possible that there will be a cooperation of governments and corporates to acquire more than 51% of the hashing power? So let's look at this as two parts, and I'll start with the second. Acquiring more than 51% of the hashing power does not enable someone to change the consensus rules. This is very important to understand. Acquiring more than 51% of the hashing power allows someone to do a censorship attack on Bitcoin where they can slow down the processing of transactions, prevent certain transactions from being processed, or prevent all transactions from being processed until there are countermeasures taken against those miners in the network. That kind of attack can deny service on Bitcoin, but very importantly, 51% attack cannot change the rules. If you change the rules with a 51% attack, what you end up doing is you end up forking Bitcoin and creating a minority fork that doesn't have economic activity on it. We've seen this happen before. It's happened several times. In fact, there are more than 45 forks of Bitcoin where various parties tried to change the rules. And in some cases, a majority of the miners wanted to change the rules, as happened in August 2017, and they ended up losing hundreds of millions of dollars through that attempt and ultimately failed in changing the rules. Who decides what rules Bitcoin has? You decide what rules you run on your software in the network that you participate in, and you decide to call Bitcoin, and you decide to dedicate your economic activity, interests, and savings, labor, creativity, and passion into that project. We all decide. We decide through our economic activity. We decide through the choices of which software we run. It doesn't matter if 51% of the hash power decides to do something else. We can ignore them. So, to the first part, could big corporations and large investors change the rules, or governments change the rules of Bitcoin? No. It's as simple as that. No, they can't. What they can do is they can create enough of a blockade and confusion around Bitcoin to suppress the price of Bitcoin, but not suppress the use of Bitcoin in the places where the use of Bitcoin really, really matters. And so, yes, they could probably do a blockade on exchanges. They could prevent exchanges from using Bitcoin unless they followed a complicated set of rules. They could even force exchanges to use a different version of Bitcoin that doesn't have the capabilities that Bitcoin has today. And what that would do is it would simply mean that there are now two versions of Bitcoin. The one that exchanges use and the one that everybody else uses because they're not an exchange and they don't want to follow those rules. The point is, all that can do is it can affect the price of Bitcoin on exchanges, but it can't change the rules that you choose for Bitcoin when you're running it. Let's see what else we have here. We're about halfway through this MOOC. We've got a lot of questions. I'm still on page 2 of 8. We are not going to get to all of the questions today. Now, I'm going to scroll down a bit and we're going to talk a bit about mining and mining pools. SHA-256 in Bitcoin mining, what exactly is the riddle to be solved? Uwe asks. in terms of SHA-256 hash calculation, what is exactly the riddle that miners have to solve to create bitcoins on the blockchain? The riddle they have to solve is they have to produce a SHA-256 hash of the block header that has a specific pattern in it. So, let's start with the pattern itself. If you look on a block explorer at any one of the blocks, you will notice something interesting. If you look at the header hash, this is the SHA-256 fingerprint of the first 80 bytes of the Bitcoin block, which contains information such as a timestamp, such as the block version, the Merkle root of transactions and Coinbase information that's in there, as well as a few other fields, and the nonce, which is a randomly selected number that the miners put in. If you take that hash and you look at it on a block explorer, you'll notice an interesting pattern. It starts with 0. In fact, it starts with many zeros. So if you look at that hash, it's 0000000, and then some other numbers. Depending on whether you look at it in hex or binary or any other number system, it will always start with zeros. And if you think of it in binary, you can basically assume that the first several bits, the most significant bits in the block header hash are zeros. So in binary, where it can be 0 or 1, that hash will be 000000000, and then 10111001111, some combination of zeros and ones that make up the rest of the number. Now, if you think about how SHA-256 works, or how any hash algorithm works, a hash algorithm will take some amount of data, in this case the block header, which is 80 bytes, and from that it will produce a 256-bit 32 bytes of hash. Effectively, it's compressing or digesting that, but it's digesting it in a way that creates what effectively looks like a random number. So you put a block header into SHA, and out pops this number, and this number is 256 bits long. Now, what does it mean for it to start with lots of zeros? Effectively, what it means is it is a small number, or it is smaller than what it might be if it didn't start with zeros. Just like the number 0000552 is smaller than the number 100000552, right? And number 1 in the most significant bits will produce a much larger number. The same thing in binary. If the leftmost bits are zeros, then the number is smaller than a specific target. So the riddle to be solved is, if you put a block header into SHA, can you make it produce a number that is smaller than a specific target, and that target is called the difficulty target. And obviously, the lower the difficulty target gets, the harder it is to produce a number that is smaller than that. Now, let's say all of 256-bit numbers, the 10 to the 77 numbers that are defined by 256 bits are this space, 0 at the bottom, 2 to the 256 at the top. Well, if the difficulty target is here, only these hashes are valid. If it's here, only these hashes are valid. If it's here, only these hashes are valid. And the lower we get, the more we squash it. In fact, every time one of the bits is 0, half as many results are available. So if the first part of SHA-256 is a 0 bit, that means of the entire space of numbers, only the lower half, because you divide by 2, is available. If you take the next bit and make it 0, only 1/4 is available, 1/8, etc., etc. And you keep squashing that close to the bottom. Now, because it's such an enormous number, there's plenty of numbers even if you squash it. And the riddle for miners is this. You can't predict what's going to pop out of the SHA-256. You put in a block header, some number that appears completely random, but is not. It's deterministic. You put the same block header in, it will produce the same number, but you never know what number is going to pop out the other side. You can't predict it. You can't make it be a specific number. You can just change the header a bit and try again. So you change the header and you try again and a different number pops out. And then you count. How many zeros does it have? Is it low enough? No. And you're going to get the answer to is it low enough trillions and trillions and quadrillions and quintillions and septillions of times before, by pure coincidence, you plug in a block header that happens, due to the implementation of SHA-256, to pop up a number that has so many zeros in the beginning that it is lower than the difficulty target. Why is that difficult? Because it takes septillions of attempts to find, by chance, a block header that produces a number that is low enough. And that's the riddle. That's really it. You set the bar, the number has to be smaller, but you can't predict the number. You can just keep throwing block headers at this algorithm as fast as you can in order to see what it produces. And when it produces a number that is low enough, you win. And then you tell the whole world, look, I found a block header that, by pure coincidence, when I tried this combination of nonce and timestamp and the other information in the block header in SHA-256, look at the hash it produced. And everyone can say, let me check for myself. Take that same block header, put it through SHA-256, and they will get the same hash, and they will see all of these zeros in the beginning. And they will know that the only way you could have found that, since you can't predict what comes out of SHA-256, was by trying septillions of operations. You can do the calculation statistically to find how many times you have to try. And that there proves that the miner did the work. It's proof of work. And that's basically the genius behind the proof of work system. Bruno asks, imagine the case that you have been mining Bitcoin from the very beginning and never got a reward. Is that possible? Is it the case that you never discover a block? Yes, Bruno, it absolutely is possible. Because essentially, if you think about it, every time you hash a block header, it's like trying a lottery ticket. It's trying to throw dice. But so many dice. And to find a specific number, could you be trying forever and never find it? Yes. In fact, the opposite is also true. You might have no hashing power at all. You might just manually type a block header into your computer, pass it through SHA-256, and be so lucky that you hit the 1 in a septillion chance and you get a valid block header. The very first hash you do on the very first minute of the very first day of your mining experience, you find a valid block header and you're like, wow, that was lucky. Now, of course, that kind of luck doesn't really exist. This is a game of probability. So if you think about probabilities, is there a probability to do this? Yes, but that is so low that we have to understand the difference between possibility and probability. Is it possible? Yes. Is it probable? No. It's as simple as that. It is equivalent to winning the Powerball lottery 20 times in a row, the first 20 times you play it. So yes, it is possible, but nobody's going to do it because it is so improbable. It is just as possible to find in your first hash as it is possible to never find. Now let's look at the competition between miners. Excellent. Actually, David made a good point in the chat I'm noticing now. The problem, complex and mathematical. The solution, guessing. Yes, that's basically it. That's what keeps miners honest, because guessing is something that you can't cheat at. It's really simple. It's a provable guess. It's a guess where you can't cheat. but everyone can check the result, and by checking the result, they know how hard you had to guess, which is really fascinating. Claudio asks, a miner selecting the transactions from the mempool and guessing the nonce is constructing a block that is completely different from another miner that is doing the same thing, right? I mean, the selection of transactions from the mempool is completely up to the miner. This is a very important, very, very important insight. Claudio, you are absolutely correct. Each miner constructs a candidate block. This candidate block will include anywhere up to 2,500 transactions. Those transactions will be compressed in a Merkle tree, where the final Merkle root, this is a tree of hashes, it's not important, but basically it's summarized as a single hash, where the final Merkle root will depend on not only which transactions are included by the miner, but in what order they were included in their candidate block. The miner will also put other information in there, such as a Coinbase transaction that rewards them, or their mining pool if they're operating as part of a mining pool, and they'll put a timestamp that is the precise time to milliseconds of when they started doing this. Sorry, not milliseconds, seconds. The precise time to seconds of when they started doing this. I think it's seconds, I'm not sure. And so as a result, every candidate block will be different. And it doesn't have to be different by a lot, because one of the key properties of a hash algorithm, a cryptographically secure hash algorithm, is that if you change 1 bit in the input of the hash algorithm, the output should be spread uniformly somewhere in the 256-bit number space of the result. Meaning that when you change 1 bit in the input, the output doesn't change by 1 bit. Almost every bit changes in the output in what is called a cascade effect. So that ensures that a cryptographically secure hash algorithm will produce a completely different fingerprint, even if you've only changed 1 bit in the input. And of course, each miner is changing many bits. When they do a candidate block, they can't even guess at what order of transactions, precisely which transactions they include, to be the same as another miner who's also trying at the exact same time. And even their timestamp is going to be different. And of course, the Coinbase transaction that rewards them is definitely going to be different. So they're all starting from a different candidate block, which has a different block header. And even if they all started with the nonce 0, they would get different hashes, because the nonce is just one part of the block header. And as long as something else is different from all of the other candidate blocks, they could all be trying the same nonce. In fact, when they run out of space for trying new nonces and they still haven't guessed the block, what they do is they make a tiny change. They update the timestamp, for example, if enough time has elapsed, or they shuffle a couple of transactions in the Merkle tree to change the order and therefore change the Merkle root completely, which will change the block header. And that allows them to start again with nonce 0. And in fact, it doesn't matter which nonce you start with. You can just start at 0 and keep incrementing until you try all possible combinations of the nonce. And that's exactly how mining works. That's why 2 miners will never find the same block. They might find the block at the same height. Every block has, as part of its header, a very important component. It has the hash of the previous block, also known as its parent. That's how they are chained together in a block chain. So a miner chooses which block they are extending to make the block chain longer. They choose the parent. So all of the miners, when they're building a candidate block at a specific height, are choosing the same parent, with one exception we'll see in a bit. And so as a result, even though they're choosing the same parent, even though they're choosing from the same mempool, they will have fundamentally different block headers because of all of the other data that's in there, and they will be producing different hashes. This also answers Frida's question, do all candidate blocks include the same transactions? How is it being ensured that all transactions are validated? Are the transactions chosen from the mempool for a candidate block in chronological order, or is it random? Frida, neither chronological nor random. transactions are chosen based on profitability. Specifically, they're chosen to maximize the amount of transaction fees that the miner can earn by including those transactions in the block. So miners have algorithms that look into the mempool and they sort transactions by the amount of fee per size of that transaction so that they can stuff the block with as many transactions as possible, paying the highest rate possible. And this enables a competitive market for fees. If you want your transaction included, you increase the fee, which motivates miners to include it in the very next block. And so there are many scenarios where transactions are not validated. If you do not pay sufficient fee to be included in this block, or the next, and people keep paying more transactions fee per byte than your transaction will always be just outside the size that can fit in a block and will not get selected to be put in a candidate block and therefore will not get mined. Now let's talk about a very interesting scenario which we need to cover to understand mining more specifically. David asks, what happens when two blocks are mined at the same time? If two new blocks are generated at the same time by different miners, how does the network decide which one to add to the blockchain? This is the essence of how the Byzantine fault-tolerant proof-of-work consensus algorithm works, and Dave has found the most important question for today's lesson. Congratulations, David. You get no reward or prize other than satisfaction. What happens when two blocks are generated at the same time or near the same time by different miners? Now, both are valid. Both have valid transactions. Different transactions, most likely, or slightly different headers. Both have the same parent. Both are trying to extend the same chain by one, the same parent by one. They're both siblings of each other. They're children of the same parent. So siblings. Now, when these two blocks are found, each of the miners will immediately propagate them to everyone who is directly connected with them. Now, imagine if these miners are in fact separated on the network by great distances. Not geographically, but we can use geographically as a proxy. The network isn't geographically arranged, but let's say it was. So let's say one of the miners is in Canada and the other miner is in Australia, and they both find the block at the same time. Now, they will each tell everyone around them, and the block will propagate out to their neighbors. Each of those neighbors will validate the block. They will see it as the winning block, and they will then tell everyone around them, and it will propagate further and further and further and further. Two waves spreading out from the two miners, and they'll meet somewhere in the middle of the network. All of the nodes on one side of the network hear the Canadian block, let's call it first. It's valid, they hear it. So they update their own copy of the blockchain. On the other side of the network, all of the nodes hear the Australian block, and they update. Now, what happens when they meet in the middle? Well, some nodes will hear the Canadian, some nodes will hear the Australian, and then they'll continue to propagate. But all of the nodes that hear the second block, if they first hear the Canadian and then they hear about the Australian one, will assume that the Australian block lost, that it was too late, that everyone else also heard the Canadian block first. And so as a result, you're going to have temporarily a disagreement across the network as to which block was mined first. And as a result of that disagreement, miners who are located on either side of this network will assume that the winning block is the one they received first, and they will try to extend that chain, which means that there will be a situation where you have what's known as a consensus fork. This is normal, and it happens on average every couple of weeks. So every couple of weeks, and in fact it happened a couple months ago or maybe a month ago, and everyone made a huge deal out of it because they also detected a double spend attempt within those two competing blocks. We'll get to that in a bit. Now, what happens when you have two children at the same height, both of which are valid? Half the network thinks one, the other half thinks the other was the winner. Well, the miners that receive the Canadian block first will start building a child block to extend that chain that will designate the Canadian block as its parent. And they will start furiously trying to find a proof of work result by hashing the block header of this new candidate block that explicitly states that the Canadian block is its parent. Meanwhile, miners who saw the Australian block first and think that one won will start to try to extend that chain by creating candidate blocks that designate the Australian block hash as the parent, and they will start mining furiously. Now, the chance is that one or the other side will win decisively this time. It won't be two simultaneous results. And so that's exactly how it's resolved. Now let's say that a miner in Malaysia was able to find a solution, and they had seen the Australian block first, and therefore they built a child that designates the Australian block as its parent and extends that chain. So you have at that moment a chain with a one block fork at the top, and the Malaysian block builds on top of the Australian one, extending it by one. And that now is propagated out from Malaysia across the entire network. Every node in between will see this new Malaysian block and say, hey, this Malaysian block extends the Australian chain. Let's see which one's longest. And they will calculate the cumulative difficulty, and they will find that the blockchain with Malaysia at its tip, the Malaysian block at its tip, that has Australia as its parent, the Australian block, has more cumulative difficulty. They will therefore pick that chain as the correct chain. At the core of the consensus algorithm is the greatest cumulative difficulty chain wins. So that result ensures that the Australian block, in the end, is the one that is included. Even those who were trying to extend the Canadian block, even those who thought that the Canadian block was winning, they will see this new Malaysian block. They will notice that it's not extending the Canadian block as they thought, it's extending the Australian block. And therefore they will say, oh, I guess the rest of the network thought that Australia won the previous round, and they will discard the Canadian block. In discarding the Canadian block, one of the things they'll also do is try to reprocess its transactions. Now, they've taken them out of the mempool temporarily because they think they've been included in the Canadian block. Now they have to compare. They'll look at the Canadian block and the Australian block that they now know is a winner, and they will say, how many of the transactions in here are actually also in the Australian block? Anything that's already included in the Australian block that is now on the longest chain is valid. Therefore, those transactions are done. We've already confirmed them. And there will often be a very, very high degree of overlap. Maybe 90% of the transactions are in both. So they've already been confirmed. They've just been confirmed on the Australian side. And there will be some transactions that were only in the Canadian block. That unfortunately did not get confirmed because that block is now invalid. And those transactions go back in the mempool, back in the waiting line. So they are no longer confirmed. This is why sometimes you will see a transaction that has one confirmation, and then a few seconds later it has 0 confirmations. Why? Well, it was in a block that just got orphaned, as it's called, or a stale block. So that block is stale. The transactions that are only in it go back in the mempool. And what happens if there are two competing versions of the transaction? Whatever the Australian block says wins. And as a result, that is the only history that is preserved as far as the network is concerned. After that block is confirmed, the Canadian block is discarded and is not assumed to be part of history. Now, nodes actually keep these blocks around, and the reason they keep these blocks around is because you might then get a two-block chain extended on the old side, which will cause the network to reconverge the other way. But the probability of two blocks in a row getting confirmed is exponentially less than having two simultaneous miners find one block. The chance of that happening for 3 blocks is exponentially less. The chances of that happening for 4 blocks is exponentially less. And if you actually do the math, you'll see, in fact, in the white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto, there is only one equation on page 8. And that equation calculates the probability of a block fork that happens after 1, 2, 3, etc. And it calculates how that probability decreases. And the reason why we say that it's safe to assume that after 6 confirmations it cannot be reversed is because at that point the probability has dropped so low that it is considered extremely improbable. Every couple of weeks a 1-block fork happens. Once or twice a year, a 2-block consensus fork happens, just by chance. Once every several years, a 3-block fork should happen by chance. I do not believe a 3-block consensus fork has happened in the 12 years of Bitcoin so far by chance. It has not happened. A 4-block fork would be decades, a 5-block fork would be centuries, and a 6-block fork would take millennia of mining before it happened simply by accident. And that's why we say 6 confirmations and you're golden. It's a probability, it's not a certainty. Bitcoin is a probabilistic consensus algorithm, which means that the agreement on what just happened is inexistent at 0 confirmations. It is good enough every 2 weeks probability for 1 confirmation, and then it gets better and better and better the more blocks you add, until after 6 confirmations we assume this is not going to happen by chance in millennia, and therefore that's good enough for any transaction you might do of any amount you might do. Now, you may not care for confirmation of a $10 transaction. You may care for confirmation of a $10 million transaction if that is an irreversible exchange of value. And therefore you would wait 6. And of course, exchanges wait a minimum of 3 and often 6 confirmations, because what they're doing is giving you another form of currency that you can effectively run away with, and so they want to make sure that that is final and confirmed. Juan Pablo has a very interesting question. When does the block reward become effective? After how many confirmations? This is a special rule in consensus. The block reward actually becomes effective, spendable, only after 100 confirmations. And that's because since miners are participants in consensus, they could effectively game the system so as to enable double spending of their mining rewards by reorganizing entire chains of more than 100 blocks and colluding against each other. But by setting it to 100 blocks, you've got a very good chance that no one's going to collude that far, because there is enormous risk in doing so. So that's why the reward confirmation is so much longer. Let's see what else we have. I think over the next couple of weeks we're going to talk about 51% attacks and the risks that come with that. But unfortunately, we have now run out of time. So that's all of the questions I'm able to answer today. I think we got a nice, good introduction into Byzantine fault-tolerant systems, a good introduction into the fundamentals of mining, how the SHA-256 algorithm enables us to do guesses that are verifiable, that require a predictable amount of difficulty, which therefore acts as proof of work, and what happens when, by chance, two valid solutions are found at the same time, and how does the Byzantine fault-tolerant system reconverge and reorganize the blockchain to arrive at a common answer one block later. And what happens when that's 2 blocks or 3 blocks or 4 blocks, and how the probabilities work there. You should now have a good understanding of how consensus is arrived over longer periods of time through this mechanism of probabilistic Byzantine fault tolerance. I'm Andreas Antonopoulos. I'm your teacher for the 15th semester of the massive open online course for the University of Nicosia's master's degree in digital currencies. This was a great session. I really enjoyed answering your questions, and unfortunately we had so many good questions that I was not able to get into the level of depth that I feel is necessary for all of these questions. But I will answer more of them next week, and I'm sure many of these will be carried forward as they will be relevant to further conversations in this course. So keep at it. We have week 3 coming up, and in week 3, I will ask that you please submit your questions in the forums, giving our staff at the university an opportunity to answer many of your questions, but also giving you an opportunity to have a conversation with your colleagues, your other students who are taking this course, so you can all learn from each other. And I will see you next Thursday at the same time for session 3. That's all for me. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye, everyone.